The girl was dead, of course, but the voice of her angel remained. That is the impossible truth I must now try to explain, a truth that ripped the veil from my understanding of life, death, and the very fabric of God's mysterious grace. I am Father Michael, and I have witnessed a miracle so profound, so utterly defiant of every natural law, that it has left me a haunted man of God, struggling daily to reconcile what I saw with what I believe. It began in the sterile, hushed quiet of a hospital room, a space already heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the oppressive finality of a human life extinguished. Little Annalise, all 7 years of her, lay still on the bed. Her small chest no longer rose and fell. Her vibrant, curious eyes were closed, sealed by a peace that was both sorrowful and absolute. The flat line on the monitor, a single unwavering tone, had been echoing in the small room for moments that stretched into eternity. Dr. Peterson, a man whose kindness was only matched by his staunch scientific pragmatism, had taken her pulse one last time. His sigh, a soft, defeated sound, was followed by the clinical pronouncement that still rings in my ears. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. Mark and Sarah Vance, Annalise's parents, clung to each other, their bodies racked by a silent, bone-deep grief. They were good people, simple people, their faith tested to its limits by a daughter whose claim to commune with an angel had brought them both solace and condemnation. I had just finished the prayers for the dead, my voice thick with emotion, my hands still warm from anointing her brow, convinced that the tragic story of the girl who dreamt of angels had come to its sad, predictable end. We were witnesses to sorrow, nothing more. Then it started. It wasn't a sound that erupted. It was a sound that simply was asterisk. It seemed to materialize from the very air itself, not through the ears first, but directly into the core of one's being. A resonance, subtle at first, like the whisper of distant chimes, growing with an impossible swiftness. My breath hitched. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, a static charge in the air that raised the fine hairs on my arms. Sarah gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and Mark tightened his grip on her. But their heads were already turning, searching the empty space above Annalise's bed. The sound intensified, no longer a whisper, but a symphony. It was like the ringing of 1,000 silver bells, each perfectly tuned, each vibrating with an ancient celestial power, forged into a single perfect chord of speech. It wasn't just beautiful, it was terrifying. It was beyond human capacity to create or comprehend. My mind, trained in logic and theology, struggled to process the input. Hallucination, collective hysteria. No, the sound was too real, too physical. It hummed in my teeth, vibrated in my chest, and pressed against my eardrums with a gentle but undeniable force. And then it spoke. It wasn't a language I recognized, yet every syllable was understood. It was a message meant only for us. The stunned and grieving witnesses gathered around her small, still form. The voice was not harsh or demanding. It was pure, resonant grace. It carried with it the scent of blooming jasmine and something else, something undefinable, like ozone after a lightning strike, or the air of a place untouched by human sorrow. This was not a spirit lingering. This was something else, something asterisk, more asterisk. The words, though unspoken in any earthly tongue, flooded my consciousness with an unyielding clarity. It spoke of faith, of courage, of a journey completed. It spoke Annalise's name, and in that utterance, every doubt, every accusation, every skeptical whisper that had ever surrounded her faded into nothingness. The child who had been called a liar, a dreamer, a victim of her own fertile imagination, she was gone. Yet the undeniable proof of her extraordinary claim echoed off the hospital walls, a divine and terrifying sound that shattered our grief and replaced it with a holy, paralyzing awe. We were frozen. The doctor, usually so composed, had fallen to his knees, his face pale, his medical training utterly useless against the impossible reality unfolding before him. Mark and Sarah, their tears still wet, were looking upwards, their expressions a mixture of terror and an almost unbearable joy. No one moved, no one dared. We simply absorbed the miracle, or the horror, as it unfolded. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat against the serene, unfathomable presence. This wasn't something to be rationalized. This wasn't something to be prayed away. This was the raw, unadulterated presence of something beyond our world, made manifest in the most shocking, the most undeniable way imaginable. The voice continued, a cascade of pure, resonant truths, each one a hammer blow to my preconceived notions of the divine. It lingered not for minutes, but for an eternity, reshaping the very air we breathe, imprinting itself upon our souls. When it finally began to recede, fading back into the silence from which it had sprung, the quiet was no longer sterile. It was pregnant with a profound, terrifying knowledge. What we witnessed, what we heard, defies all explanation. It challenges everything I, as a man of God, have ever been taught. I write this now, years later, still haunted by that transcendent sound, still grappling with the ramifications of that night. The world believes in miracles, but few are granted the terrifying privilege of standing at the threshold where death becomes prophecy, where a child's last breath ushers in the undeniable voice of the divine. I understand if you find this impossible to believe. I did too, until my own senses betrayed every logical and theological principle I held dear. This is the burden of my truth. This is the story of Annalise Vance and the angel who spoke after she was gone. And if you have the courage, I will tell you everything. To understand that impossible sound, that divine echo which shattered the very fabric of our reality, we must go back. We must retrace the steps to a time before the bells chimed and the light shone, to a season of quiet, unassuming days in our small town of Oak Haven. It began, as so many profound shifts in life often do, not with a clap of thunder or a blinding flash, but on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. 6 months before Annalise's heart would cease its rhythm, Oak Haven is the kind of town where the rhythm of life is set by the church bells and the changing seasons. People know their neighbors, their joys and sorrows, and a stranger walking down Main Street is a rare, noted event. Life moves at a measured pace, allowing for quiet reflection, for the tending of gardens and the sharing of coffee on front porches. My parish, St. Michael's, had always been a sanctuary of predictable comfort, its stained glass windows depicting familiar saints, its liturgy following a well-worn path of tradition. My days, too, were generally structured. Morning mass, visits to the sick, counseling, preparing homilies, the occasional funeral or wedding. I prided myself on my prudence, on my ability to offer counsel grounded in both theological wisdom and common sense. I was a shepherd, yes, but one who kept a careful eye on the earthly bounds of his flock. The Vance family were pillars of our community, though they would never claim such a title themselves. Mark, a carpenter with hands always smelling faintly of sawdust and pine, was a man of quiet integrity. Sarah, his wife, a kindergarten teacher whose laugh was like the chime of small bells, possessed a spirit both gentle and resilient. Their home, a modest bungalow on Elm Street, was always filled with the scent of baking bread and the murmur of gentle conversation. And then there was Annalise. Annalise Vance was a quiet girl, even for a 7-year-old. She moved through the world with an almost ethereal grace, her small hands often clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on something unseen. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky just after a rain shower, held a depth that belied her tender years. She was not shy precisely, but rather observant, as if constantly listening to a symphony only she could hear. She loved to draw, filling sketchbooks with intricate patterns and figures that seemed to float just beyond recognition. No one would have ever marked her as extraordinary, not in the way the world understands the term. She was simply Annalise. That particular Tuesday morning, Sarah was preparing breakfast, the scent of sizzling bacon mingling with coffee, when Annalise wandered into the kitchen. She settled into her chair at the small, checkered table, pulling her cereal bowl closer with both hands. "Mommy," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "Casil told me a story about a little bird this morning." Sarah paused, spatula hovering over the pan. "Casil, honey, is that a new friend from school?" she asked, her tone light, accustomed to the imaginative flourishes of childhood. Annalise shook her head slowly, her blue eyes wide. "Oh no, Mommy, Casil is my angel. He came to my room when the sun was just starting to wake up." A small tremor went through Sarah. Her mind, ever practical, immediately searched for a mundane explanation. An imaginary friend, perhaps. A dream. But Annalise wasn't given to wild fantasies. Her play was often simple, her stories grounded in the world she saw around her. "Your angel, sweetheart." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her voice softening, trying to gauge the child's sincerity. "And where does Casil live?" Annalise pointed, not at the ceiling of their kitchen, but upward, with an unhesitating gesture that seemed to pierce the very sky. "He's from the house of the Father. He says I must be brave." The words hung in the air, a whisper of the profound in the ordinary domestic space. "He says I must be brave." What a strange message for a 7-year-old girl to receive from an imaginary friend, or from anywhere. It was not a message about games or toys or schoolyard adventures. It carried a weight, an unspoken prophecy that unsettled Sarah to her core. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away, but the serene conviction in Annalise's eyes, the utter simplicity of her declaration, made it impossible. Over the next few days, Annalise continued to speak of Casil. She would recount their conversations at dinner while drawing or walking hand in hand with her mother through the autumn leaves. She never spoke of fantastic feats or grand visions, only of simple lessons. Casil had taught her how to truly forgive a friend who had been unkind. Casil had explained why it was important to share her toys, not just with her friends, but with the new, shy boy in her class. Most profoundly, Casil spoke of God's love, not as a concept from a catechism book, but as a palpable, all-encompassing presence, a warmth that filled the universe. Annalise described it with the vivid clarity of one who had felt its embrace. Mark, bless his practical heart, initially suggested it was a phase, a vivid dream life. But as the conversations became more frequent, more detailed, and as Annalise's gentle wisdom grew far beyond anything they had instilled in her, both parents began to feel a profound disquiet. It wasn't the disquiet of fear, not yet, but of a quiet, dawning in. They were good Catholic people, yes, but such things as angels speaking daily to children belonged in saints' lives, in dusty tomes, not in their sunlit kitchen. They were caught between the desire to protect their daughter from ridicule and a growing, unsettling feeling that something truly extraordinary was unfolding within their home. It was Sarah who finally called me. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, laced with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, almost embarrassed awe. "Father Michael," she began, "it's about Annalise. We think she might be talking to an angel." I remember the precise moment I received that call. I was in my study, surrounded by theological texts, the scent of old paper and beeswax polish filling the air. My first reaction, I confess, was one of practiced skepticism. In my years of priesthood, I had encountered many children with vivid imaginations, many parents seeking explanations for their child's unique quirks. Most often, these mystical experiences were easily explained by a love for stories, a creative mind, or sometimes a deeper psychological need. My role, as I saw it, was to be a shepherd, yes, but also a protector against delusion, a guardian of sound doctrine. I was trained to be prudent, to counsel caution, to seek natural explanations before leaping to the supernatural. "Of course, Sarah," I had said, my voice carefully modulated, betraying none of my internal assumptions. "I'd be happy to come by and chat with Annalise. Perhaps she's just been reading too many stories about saints." I smiled into the phone, hoping she'd hear the gentle reassurance, not the underlying skepticism. I arrived at the Vance home a few days later, a crisp autumn afternoon with leaves skittering across their porch. The house felt warm and welcoming, just as always. Sarah ushered me in, her eyes holding a nervous flicker, while Mark sat on the sofa, his hands clasped, a frown etched between his brows. Annalise was coloring at the kitchen table, absorbed in her task, her small head bent over the page. I sat down across from her, carefully. "Hello, Annalise," I began, my voice as kind and soft as I could make it. "Your mom and dad tell me you've made a new friend." She looked up, her blue eyes meeting mine without a trace of shyness. There was no guile there, no childish eagerness to impress, just a quiet, unwavering directness. "Yes, Father Casil, and Casil is an angel, your mother says," I asked, my tone light, almost conversational, as if asking about a classmate. Annalise nodded, picking up a crayon, her movements unhurried. "Yes, he's very kind and very bright. Sometimes he glows." I paused, absorbing her words. There was no theatricality, no embellishment. She spoke of Casil not with the breathless wonder of a child recounting a fairy tale, but with the simple clarity of someone stating an undeniable fact, like describing the color of the sky. "What does Casil tell you, Annalise?" I probed gently, trying to lead her into the kind of fantastical narrative I expected. She put down her crayon, her gaze thoughtful. "He tells me about God. He says God's love is like the sun, everywhere, even when you can't see it. And he tells me that when people are hurting, it's because they've forgotten how much God loves them, and we should try to remind them with our own love." She spoke with a quiet certainty that held me rapt. It wasn't parroted speech. There was an understanding in her voice, a gentle conviction that was profoundly unsettling to my carefully constructed expectations. I asked her about the specifics of her conversations, trying to find a crack in the narrative, a sign of invention. Did he have wings? What did he wear? How did he speak? "He doesn't wear clothes like us, Father," she explained patiently, as if to a slightly dull-witted adult. "He is made of light, mostly, and his voice, it's not like ours. It comes from inside, right here." She touched her small hand to her chest, over her heart. "It's like a song, a very quiet, happy song, and the words just ... appear in my head. And sometimes it feels like all the colors in the world sing with him." My professional, prudent facade began to crack. She wasn't recounting a story, she was describing an experience. The details were consistent, devoid of the wild inconsistencies common to childish fantasy, and the content, it was not tales of mischief or games, but profound lessons of charity, forgiveness, and the boundless love of God. She spoke of these spiritual truths with a wisdom that transcended her years, a wisdom that felt ancient, distilled, and pure. It was not what one hears in a typical catechism class, not even from the most dedicated teacher. It was as if she had direct access to the source. As I listened, my carefully nurtured skepticism began to give way to something else, a deep, quiet wonder. A seed, small and fragile, began to plant itself in the hardened soil of my soul. I had come to counsel caution, to gently redirect what I presumed was an overactive imagination. Instead, I found myself in the presence of a child of serene, unshakable conviction, a child whose simple declarations challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the earthly and the divine. I left the Vance home that day more shaken than I let on. I still held to my priestly duty of prudence, of course. I encouraged Mark and Sarah to observe, to listen, but not to publicize. I told them to keep talking to Annalise, to simply be present. But within me, the questions churned. Was it possible? Could such grace truly manifest so directly, so purely, in a child of Oakhaven? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It meant that the walls between heaven and earth, which I had always perceived as so firm and distinct, might be far more permeable than my theology allowed. I began to pray differently after that. My prayers, once requests for guidance for my flock, began to include pleas for understanding for myself. I found myself searching the scriptures with a renewed urgency, seeking parallels, seeking wisdom beyond the intellectual. Annalise Vance, a quiet 7-year-old, had, in a single afternoon, ignited a spark of inquiry in my heart that would, in time, consume the very foundations of my faith and reshape my understanding of God's awesome, immeasurable power. Little did I know, this was just the first whisper. The world, and indeed my very soul, was about to be irrevocably changed. The first whisper, as I had called it, did not remain a whisper for long. Indeed, the moment Annalise spoke of Cecile, it was as if a match had been struck in a field of dry tinder. The spark of inquiry that had ignited in my own heart was, in the wider world of Oakhaven, a conflagration. It began subtly, as these things often do, with hushed conversations over coffee at the diner or after Sunday Mass. A shared glance, a whispered question, "Have you heard about the Vance girl?" Soon, however, the whispers began to rise, gaining volume and urgency, like a distant storm gathering strength before breaking upon the quiet landscape of our town. The catalyst, I believe, was not merely the extraordinary nature of Annalise's claim, but the profound, almost unsettling serenity with which she carried it. She did not preach or proselytize. She simply knew asterisks. And in her knowing, a strange phenomenon began to unfold around her family's modest home on Elm Street. At first, it was just a few well-meaning neighbors, leaving small, heartfelt gifts, a bouquet of wildflowers, a handmade rosary, a little porcelain angel figure on the porch. These were gestures of quiet support, of shared wonder. But the trickle soon became a stream, then a veritable flood. Within weeks, the Vance home had become what some began to call the unofficial shrine. I remember standing across the street, one crisp autumn afternoon, watching the scene unfold. A continuous quiet procession moved along the sidewalk, a curious mix of the pious and the simply perplexed. There were mothers pushing strollers, their faces etched with a hope I recognized from countless confessionals, longing for a sign, for reassurance that miracles still threaded through the fabric of our often painful world. There were elderly men, their hands gnarled with years of labor, clutching worn prayer books, their eyes fixed on the simple porch with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. Young people, too, arrived, drawn by the undeniable current of something profound, perhaps seeking an answer to questions they hadn't even fully formed yet. The air around the house was thick with a peculiar blend of incense from small, smoldering burners placed on the lawn, and the sweet, decaying scent of hundreds of cut roses wilting gently in impromptu vases and mason jars. Candles flickered in silent devotion, their small flames dancing defiance against the encroaching twilight. The Vances' mailbox was overflowing with letters, many of them sealed with tear stains, addressed simply to the Angel Girl. People would kneel on the lawn, some in quiet prayer, others weeping openly, their gazes fixed on the upstairs window where Annalise was rumored to be. I saw people touch the fence, the porch railing, as if hoping to draw some faint echo of the divine from these mundane surfaces. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of faith, a desperate reaching for something beyond the mundane, and it moved me profoundly, even as it filled me with a sense of unease. How does a priest, trained in the rigorous logic of theology and the measured cadence of pastoral care, reconcile such spontaneous, unbridled devotion? My role, as I understood it, was to shepherd, to guide, to interpret the mysteries of faith within the established boundaries of the Church. Yet here was faith untamed, surging forth with a primal force that defied categorization. My initial spark of inquiry, which had felt so personal, so internal, was now mirrored in the collective yearning of our town. I prayed for wisdom, for discernment, feeling utterly inadequate to the task of navigating this unprecedented spiritual tide. But for every believer who sought solace or a sign, there was a skeptic, their voices growing louder, harsher, fueled by a mixture of suspicion, resentment, and perhaps a deeper fear of what such an event might imply about their own carefully constructed worldview. The murmur of wonder transformed into a rumble of discontent. Annalise, once seen as a sweet, imaginative child, was increasingly branded a fraud. Her parents, Mark and Sarah, were accused of manipulation, of exploiting their daughter for attention or worse. For Mania, cruel and baseless charge leveled against two of the most unassuming salt-of-the-earth people I had ever known. It's a hoax. Father Michael, Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant and a staunch rationalist, declared after Sunday Mass one morning, his face flushed with indignation. A child's fantasy, coached by parents seeking, well, who knows what they're seeking? Publicity, pity. It's an embarrassment to Oakhaven. His words and others like them sliced through the air, creating tangible divisions in our small community. Neighbors who had shared fences and coffee for decades now eyed each other with suspicion. Families argued across dinner tables. The unity that had always defined Oakhaven began to fray, pulled apart by the opposing currents of belief and disbelief. It was as if a fault line had opened in the spiritual bedrock of our town, and everyone was forced to choose a side. Then came the local news. A reporter from the city, a young woman with a sharp, cynical smile and an even sharper camera crew, descended upon Oakhaven. Her segments, broadcast on the evening news, were condescending and dismissive. They showed grainy footage of the shrine outside the Vance home, juxtaposed with interviews of disgruntled townspeople expressing their outrage at the circus. Annalise was painted as a deluded child, her parents as opportunists. The cameras, with their cold, unblinking eyes, stripped away the delicate veil of sacred mystery and replaced it with a harsh, glaring spotlight of sensationalism. I recall watching one such segment, my stomach churning with a mixture of anger and despair. The spiritual phenomenon unfolding in Oakhaven was not for public consumption, not for the reductive lens of cable news. It was a deeply personal, deeply profound unfolding of faith, and it was being cheapened, distorted, made into a spectacle. The external pressure was not limited to the local populace or the media. The Church itself, in its wisdom and its necessary prudence, also felt compelled to act. A letter arrived from the Chancery, formal and unequivocal, informing me that a diocesan investigator would be dispatched. Father Thomas Maxwell, a man known for his meticulous adherence to canon law and his formidable intellect, was to arrive the following week. His mandate was clear: to observe me, to interview the Vance family, and to assess the veracity, or lack thereof, of Annalise's claims, all within the strictures of ecclesiastical protocol. Father Maxwell was everything I was not: precise, analytical, and seemingly immune to sentimentality. He moved through Oakhaven like a detective, asking pointed questions, taking copious notes, his gaze unwavering as he watched the Vance family. He spent hours in my office, reviewing my pastoral records, inquiring about my initial impressions of Annalise, about my theological understanding of angelic apparitions. He never directly challenged my nascent belief, but his questions always circled back to the dangers of credulity, the possibility of psychological delusion, the historical precedents of false mystics. I felt as though I, too, was under scrutiny, my own faith and judgment being weighed in the balance. It was an uncomfortable position, caught between the institutional church's need for caution and the profound, living mystery I felt myself witnessing. The pressure, however, bore down most heavily upon Mark and Sarah Vance. I saw them, good and humble people, buckle under the relentless weight of it all. The lines on Mark's face deepened, etched with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Sarah, usually so vibrant, moved with a slowness that spoke of a spirit drained. They tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy to shield Annalise from the media glare and the town's judgment, but it was an impossible task. Their once peaceful home was besieged. They stopped answering the door, their curtains drawn against the persistent gaze of the curious and the critical. I visited them frequently, often under the cloak of dusk, slipping through their back gate to avoid the lingering gawkers. I remember one evening finding them huddled in their kitchen, the only light coming from a single bare bulb casting long, stark shadows. Sarah was weeping silently into her hands while Mark sat beside her, staring blankly at the wall. "Father," Mark's voice was hoarse, raw with despair. "We don't know what to do anymore. We just want our little girl to be safe. We want our lives back. They say we're bad parents," Sarah choked out between sobs. "They say we're making her lie. But Annalise, she just knows. She talks about Cassio with such conviction. How can we tell her it's not real? How can we betray her?" Their faith, once a quiet, sturdy pillar in their lives, was strained to the breaking point. They loved Annalise fiercely, and they believed in her in their hearts. But the public condemnation and the church's scrutiny were chipping away at their resolve. They were caught in an impossible bind. To defend their daughter was to invite further scorn. To deny her experience would be to abandon her in the very crucible of her profound innocent belief. They were good, simple people, trying to navigate a cosmic event, and they were utterly ill-equipped for the task. They were suffering, and I, their priest, felt a profound inadequacy in offering them comfort or guidance, for I, too, was adrift in the same sea of bewildering wonder and crushing doubt. Annalise, in the midst of this maelstrom, remained remarkably untouched, at least outwardly. She continued to speak of Cassio with the same unwavering clarity, her summer sky eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed to defy her 7 years. When I asked her, gently, if the things people were saying bothered her, she merely shook her head. "Cassio says they don't understand, Father. He says their hearts are just looking for a way to believe, even if they don't know it yet." Her words, spoken with such simple wisdom, were a rebuke to the chaos that swirled around her, a reminder of the quiet, profound truth she carried within her small frame. But the storm clouds were gathering, not just around Oak Haven, but around Annalise herself. The spiritual energy, the emotional weight of being both a beacon of hope and a lightning rod for scorn, was beginning to take its toll. Little did any of us know that the external pressures, the public spectacle, and the mounting tension were merely a prelude to a far deeper, more intimate struggle that would soon unfold within Annalise, demanding an even greater leap of faith from us all. The ground was prepared, the stage was set, for a trial that would test the very limits of our human understanding and our capacity for belief. The ground was prepared, the stage was set, for a trial that would test the very limits of our human understanding and our capacity for belief. And indeed, the storm did break, not with a sudden, violent tempest, but with the insidious, slow erosion of life itself, manifesting first in little Annalise. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper of change that only a watchful eye, accustomed to her vibrant energy, could discern. Her summer sky eyes, once bright with the endless curiosity of childhood, seemed to dim just a fraction, a film of distant contemplation settling over them. The spirited bounce in her step gave way to a gentle deliberation, her movements becoming less impetuous, more graceful, almost ethereal. At first, her mother Sarah attributed it to the sheer exhaustion of their ordeal, the constant scrutiny, the whispers, the endless stream of curious faces on their doorstep. But as the weeks bled into a month, then 2, the changes deepened, becoming undeniably physical. Annalise began to grow frail, her small frame seeming to shrink, the bones beneath her skin becoming more pronounced. Her cheeks, once rosy with childish vigor, took on an alabaster pallor, and the delicate blue veins beneath her eyes became starkly visible, like fine threads spun of sorrow. She tired easily, falling asleep in the middle of our conversations, her head lolling gently against the cushions, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor sometimes running through her small hands. She would wake with a start, apologizing with that quiet, earnest sincerity of hers. But the weariness in her voice, a new, fragile timbre, spoke volumes. "Father Michael," she whispered one afternoon, her voice barely audible, as I knelt beside her on the sofa, a cup of warm chamomile tea untouched beside her. "Casil says, sometimes the messages are very heavy, like carrying a large stone to a high place." I reached out, my hand hovering over her forehead, wanting to soothe, to comfort, but uncertain if touch itself might be too much for her fragile state. "And you, my dear, are you finding them heavy?" She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyelids fluttering. "My spirit is strong, Father, but my body is not as brave." Those words, spoken with such disarming honesty, struck a cold fear into my heart. It was as if the spiritual energy required to commune with a celestial being, the very grace that had once radiated from her, was now consuming her, burning her candle at both ends. Her parents, Mark and Sarah, were beside themselves with worry. They took her to Dr. Peterson, a kind, dedicated man, but one rooted firmly in the observable world of science. He ran every test imaginable, his brow furrowed with increasing perplexity. Blood work, scans, neurological assessments, all came back normal. Frustratingly, bafflingly, there was no medical explanation for her rapid decline. "Her vitals are stable, Father, Doctor," Peterson confided in me one evening in the quiet privacy of his office, his voice laced with professional frustration and personal concern. He rubbed a hand over his tired face. "There's nothing clinically wrong with her. No infection, no disease marker, no systemic malfunction. Yet she's wasting away before our eyes. It's as if her body is simply giving up, without any physical reason to do so." He paused, looking at me with a gaze that pleaded for an answer I did not possess. "Have you observed anything, Father? Anything that could explain this from your unique perspective?" He left the unspoken words hanging in the air. Asterisk her fantastical claims, her imaginary friend asterisk, he was searching for a psychological trigger, a manifestation of severe stress, or perhaps a somatization disorder, but even in that realm Annalise defied diagnosis. She was lucid, calm, utterly without the anxieties or delusions typically associated with such conditions. His question, though kindly posed, laid bare the chasm between the material world and the inexplicable spiritual plane that Annalise seemed to inhabit. My torment grew with each fading day. I would sit by Annalise's bedside, watching the rise and fall of her shallow breath, and question everything. Was I failing her? Was this truly a genuine mystical experience that was quite literally consuming her? A sacrifice too profound for a child? Or had I, in my earnest desire to discern truth, allowed a dangerous delusion to go unchecked, even inadvertently encouraged it, leading this precious lamb down a path to what? To this slow, inexplicable diminishment? The weight of my calling, which had once felt like a noble purpose, now felt like a crushing burden. My nights were sleepless, filled with the agonizing replaying of every conversation with Annalise, every detail of her serene conviction, every accusation hurled by the skeptics. Had I been too credulous, too quick to see God's hand where human frailty or even deception might lie? The Church, in its ancient wisdom, always counseled prudence in matters of private revelation, demanding rigorous scrutiny lest the faithful be led astray. And here I was, Father Michael, ordinary parish priest, thrust into a mystery that defied all precedent, all scientific understanding, all simple theological categories. One afternoon, during a visit that felt particularly heavy with the unspoken fear of farewell, Annalise surprised me with a clarity that cut through my swirling doubts, if only for a moment. She was propped up on pillows, looking like a delicate porcelain doll, her small hands resting atop a worn rosary Mark had given her. "Father Michael," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, though faint. "Yes, my dear." I leaned closer, my heart aching with a tenderness that bordered on sorrow. "Casil says he is preparing me for a great journey." She looked at me, her eyes holding that familiar deep wisdom that was so unsettling in a child. There was no fear in them, only an acceptance that transcended understanding. My breath hitched in my throat. A great journey, Annalise." I managed the words catching. My mind immediately leapt to the most dreadful conclusion, the one we had all been skirting around. She nodded, a faint smile gracing her pale lips. Yes, he says, I will be with him, with our Father, and that I mustn't be afraid. He said, it is the greatest journey of all. The serenity on her face, the absolute lack of terror at the prospect of her own death was profoundly unsettling. It challenged my human instinct for preservation, for life, for health. How could a child, barely 7 years old, speak of such a thing with such peace? It was either the highest form of grace, a genuine mystical foreknowledge, or the most tragic, gentle delusion imaginable. And the first, her priest, was utterly incapable of discerning which it was. My prayers became desperate pleas, no longer formal petitions, but raw cries from the depth of my soul. I knelt before the tabernacle in the quiet hours of the night, the only witness to my agony, the flickering sanctuary lamp. Lord, give me a sign, give me wisdom. Is this from you, or is it a torment? A cruel illusion? I begged, my voice hoarse, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. Do not let this child suffer in vain. Do not let her parents suffer in ignorance. Guide my flock through this mystery that feels both sacred and devastatingly tragic. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for a path forward. I felt like a shepherd caught in a supernatural fog, unable to see the precipice ahead, unable to hear the bleating of his lost sheep, utterly alone in the vastness of an incomprehensible spiritual landscape. The faith I had preached for decades, the doctrines I had taught, the rituals I had performed, they felt like thin veils before this immense, living mystery that was consuming and I would visit Mark and Sarah almost daily, finding them increasingly hollow-eyed, their smiles strained. They clung to me, to each other, like shipwreck survivors clinging to flotsam. Sarah had stopped tending her garden, the vibrant blooms she once nurtured now wilting, mirroring the slow fading of their child. Mark, usually stoic and practical, would sit for hours just holding Annalise's hand, stroking her wispy hair, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Their faith, which had been stretched to its breaking point by the town's judgment and the church's scrutiny, now faced its ultimate trial. They loved Annalise fiercely, and they believed her, truly believed her, but seeing her physical deterioration, their hearts were breaking. Father Sarah once confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "Sometimes I wish she had never met this angel, that she was just an ordinary little girl, healthy and noisy and full of mischief." She quickly pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Forgive me, Father. That's a terrible thing to say, but to watch her fade." I simply held her hand, my own heart a raw wound. There were no platitudes, no easy answers, no comforting words that felt adequate in the face of such profound sorrow. What could I say? That God's will was mysterious. They knew that. That suffering brought grace. They were living it. All I could offer was my presence, my quiet solidarity in their pain, and the silent, desperate offering of my own shattered doubts to God. The spiritual attacks, too, seemed to intensify as Annalise weakened. The local news, sensing the impending tragedy, began to circle like vultures, ready to pounce on the story of the angel girl, whose claims would undoubtedly be dismissed as the sad delusions of a dying child. The diocesan investigator, Monsignor Davies, while maintaining a professional distance, now regarded Annalise's condition with a new, sober seriousness, but still from a place of rigorous skepticism, wary of any sensationalism. He spoke of safeguarding the church, of protecting its reputation from what he feared might be a tragic yet ultimately explainable psychological phenomenon. But Annalise, even in her extreme frailty, maintained a spiritual equilibrium that defied all logical explanation. Her trust in Cassiel, in her Father in heaven, remained unshakable. It was this unwavering conviction, held by a child whose body was failing her, that kept a fragile seed of wonder alive within me, even amidst the encroaching shadows of despair. She was a living paradox, a testament to a truth that transcended the physical, even as the physical world seemed to be reclaiming her. I found myself increasingly dwelling on the meaning of suffering, on the passion of Christ, on the thin veil between this world and the next. Annalise was teaching me, perhaps, the most profound lesson of my priesthood, that faith is not a guarantee against pain, but a way to navigate its darkest valleys. Yet, as I watched her slip further away, the question echoed in my soul. Relentless and unforgiving, would God truly allow such a pure, innocent messenger to be consumed by the very message she carried, leaving only sorrow and unanswered questions in her wake? The storm was no longer gathering. It was upon us, a quiet internal tempest, threatening to extinguish the fragile light of Annalise Vance. We were preparing for a tragedy, utterly unaware that we were instead standing on the precipice of a miracle, or perhaps, for those of us caught in the dark confusion of the moment, a final, profound silence. The ground had been prepared, indeed, and now the earth itself seemed to sigh, awaiting what felt like an inevitable, devastating end. The storm, as I had called it in my troubled prayers, was no longer a distant threat. It had broken over us with the quiet devastation of a collapsing wave. Annalise, my precious lamb, was admitted to St. Jude's Hospital on a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where the setting sun casts long, melancholy shadows mirroring the descent of our hopes. Her small body, once animated by a spirit so bright it seemed to hum with celestial energy, had become a fragile vessel, translucent and still. The doctors, good men and women who had exhausted every conventional avenue, could only offer palliative care now, their kind eyes reflecting a defeat that crushed us all. I remember the sterile scent of the hospital, a stark contrast to the familiar incense of our church, or the comforting aroma of Sarah Vance's kitchen. It was the smell of sickness and science, a place where earthly limits were acutely felt. Annalise's room was on the third floor, overlooking the quiet residential streets of Oakhaven. The window, usually a portal to the world, now framed a sky growing dim, as if even the heavens were holding their breath. She lay nestled in the pristine white sheets, her eyes closed, her breath shallow, each faint rise and fall of her chest a testament to her dwindling struggle. Her skin, once fair, was now almost luminous in its pallor, like a porcelain doll infused with a fading internal light. A thin, clear tube ran from her nose, a silent reminder of the body's frailties, and the rhythmic asterisk, beep-beep-beep asterisk of the heart monitor was a cruel metronome counting down the seconds of our collective dread. Mark and Sarah were there, of course, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have stripped them of all color. They sat on either side of Annalise's bed, holding her tiny, bird-like hands, their knuckles white. Their rosary beads, worn smooth from countless prayers, clicked softly in their clasped fingers, a hypnotic, sorrowful counterpoint to the machine's insistency. Their love for Annalise was a palpable force in that room, a radiant warmth that battled against the cold grip of fear. They spoke in hushed tones, words of comfort to their child, soft endearments, promises of eternal love. Sarah would often lean in, her cheek resting against Annalise's temple, whispering the very stories Annalise used to tell, about Casil and the Father's house, as if by repeating these holy truths she could keep her daughter tethered to this side of the veil, or at least prepare her for the journey to the other. Mark, silent and stoic, would simply stroke Annalise's hair, his thumb tracing the faint blue veins on her forehead, his eyes often welling with unshed tears that he bravely tried to blink away. Outside, the community of Oakhaven was a microcosm of the larger world, divided in its response to this unfolding tragedy. Word of Annalise's hospitalization had spread like a cold fog through the town, pulling people to the hospital grounds. A vigil had spontaneously formed, a visual representation of the deep fissures that had fractured our once harmonious community. On one side of the street, huddled beneath the venerable oak trees, were the believers. They held flickering candles, their gentle flames mirroring the fragile hope in their hearts. Rosaries were clasped, lips moved in silent prayer, and hymns, softly sung, wove a delicate tapestry of faith into the chilly night air. These were the ones who had seen Annalise not as a deluded child, but as a vessel for something sacred, something beyond our comprehension. Their faces, illuminated by candlelight, were etched with a shared sorrow and a fervent, almost desperate hope for a miracle. Their prayers were not just for Annalise's healing, but for a sign, for validation, for God to make himself known in the face of such profound suffering. Across the street, bathed in the harsh artificial glare of television news lights, stood another crowd. These were the skeptics, the curious, the cynics, their ranks bolstered by reporters eager for a sensational story. Their murmurs were not of prayer, but of speculation, their cameras flashing, capturing the solemnity on one side and the sensationalism on the other. They spoke of psychological phenomena, of parental delusion, of the inevitable, sad end to a peculiar tale. For them, Annalise's decline was simply the tragic consequence of an unchecked fantasy. They waited for the final pronouncement, ready to dissect the story, to offer their logical, scientific explanations for what they perceived as mass hysteria. The air between the two groups was thick with unspoken judgment, a spiritual chasm carved into the very fabric of our town. I moved between these two worlds. My cassock, a familiar silhouette in the hospital corridors, a bridge over a chasm I felt increasingly powerless to cross. Inside Annelise's room, I was the shepherd, charged with comforting my flock. Outside, I was the weary representative of a church under scrutiny, bearing the weight of expectation, doubt, and judgment. My prayers had, by this point, become less about demanding a cure and more about pleading for grace. Lord, if it be your will, I would whisper, grant her peace, grant her parents strength, and grant me the wisdom to understand what you are doing in this suffering. The mystery of God's ways, once a source of profound wonder, now felt like a crushing burden. Was this child, this gentle, pure soul, truly destined to be a sacrificial lamb? Her extraordinary claims ending in a quiet, unremarked death. Would her beautiful, impossible story simply fade into the annals of Oak Haven folklore, a sad legend of a gifted but troubled child? The decision to administer the anointing of the sick was not made lightly. It was a sacrament I performed with reverence, often for those facing a physical illness, preparing them for either recovery or for their journey to eternity. But with Annelise, it felt different, imbued with an almost unbearable significance. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet surrender to the inevitable. We had prayed for healing, we had hoped for a miracle, but now, as her strength ebbed with each passing hour, the focus of our prayers shifted. We were no longer begging for a reversal, but for a gentle transition, for her soul to be purified and strengthened for whatever awaited her beyond this earthly realm. Father Michael, Sarah had whispered, her voice raw with exhaustion, will you anoint her? Her eyes red-rimmed and pleading met mine, and in them I saw not despair, but a profound, aching love and a flicker of faith. Unwavering despite the encroaching darkness, I nodded, my throat tight. Of course, my dear. I prepared the holy oils, the chrism of the sick, with hands that trembled not from age, but from the immense spiritual weight of the moment. The small silver pyx, usually so light in my grasp, felt heavy, as if it contained not just consecrated oil, but the collective hopes and fears of an entire community. I remember the smell of the olive oil, a faint, clean scent, usually comforting, now imbued with a poignant finality. I cleared my throat, took a deep breath, and began the ancient, hallowed words. Through this holy anointing, I began, my voice soft but firm, echoing faintly in the hushed room. May the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the grace of the Holy Spirit. I dipped my thumb into the oil and made the sign of the cross on Annelise's forehead, her skin cool and smooth beneath my touch. The warmth of the oil seemed a small, fleeting comfort against the cold tide of her illness. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow, but a profound peace seemed to settle over her features. She looked less like a suffering child and more like an angel in repose, already half tethered to the heavens she spoke of so often. It was as if Cassiel, her friend from the house of the Father, was already there, gently preparing her for her great journey. I continued, my voice gaining strength, not from confidence, but from the deep well of priestly duty. May the Lord who frees you from sin save you and raise you up. I anointed her tiny hands. The hands that had clasped her rosary so faithfully, the hands she had used to illustrate her conversations with the angel. Each touch was a prayer, a silent plea for her comfort, for her purification, for her safe passage. Mark and Sarah had bowed their heads, their quiet sobs, the only interruption to the solemn liturgy. Their faith, though battered and bruised, held firm in this sacred moment, a testament to their profound trust in God, even as his will seemed inscrutable. They had given their daughter over to God, not just in life, but now in this painful anticipation of her passing. When I finished, I sat beside them, my hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. The room settled into a profound quiet once more, broken only by the persistent asterisk, beep, 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 asterisk of the heart monitor and the almost imperceptible rustle of the sheets as Annelise took a delicate breath. She lay there, utterly peaceful, her face serene, a faint, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. It was the smile of someone who had no fear, someone who knew precisely where she was going and who was waiting for her. We waited. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing light outside the window and the measured, unwavering rhythm of the medical equipment. We were no longer praying for a cure, but for a gentle passing, for an end to her suffering, for a quiet, holy release. Our hearts were heavy, weighted with a sorrowful acceptance. We were preparing for the finality of tragedy, for the long, painful aftermath of loss. We were braced for a quiet departure, for the profound silence that would descend when that little heart finally ceased its valiant struggle. We were utterly unaware, in the crushing grip of our grief and resignation, that we were not preparing for an end, but standing on the precipice of an impossible beginning. We were waiting for a death utterly blind to the miracle that waited just beyond the veil of our sorrow, ready to tear through the fabric of our world and reshape our understanding of God's infinite, awesome power. The quiet, internal tempest had reached its zenith, and in the profound stillness that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath, awaiting what felt like an inevitable, devastating end, a final, profound silence. But God, in His infinite wisdom and boundless love, had other plans. The digital numbers on the monitor, once a frantic living dance of hope and fear, a flickering testament to a fragile life hanging in the balance, shuddered, froze, then resolved into a stark, merciless line, a flat horizon of finality that stretched across the small screen like a chasm. Simultaneously, a single, prolonged tone, high and thin, pierced the hushed air, a keening lament that seemed to emanate not merely from the machine, but from the very soul of the room, a desolate cry that tore through the fragile peace we had so desperately tried to cultivate. It was 3:17 in the morning, that profound hour when the world feels most still, most vulnerable, and secrets seem to surface from the deepest wells. Annalis's small, valiant heart, which had fought so bravely against an enemy we could not name, an ailment that defied every medical explanation, yet consumed her with relentless certainty, had finally surrendered. I watched it happen, my own breath catching in my throat, each beat of my own heart a painful counterpoint to the silence now growing around us. Dr. Peterson, a good man whose inherent skepticism had been softened, then profoundly challenged by compassion over these long, bewildering weeks, stepped forward, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much sorrow in the cold light of clinical reality, was utterly devoid of professional detachment. His gaze, usually sharp and analytical, now held a deep, unvarnished pity. He placed a hand, gently, reverently, on Annalis's forehead, a touch so tender it was almost paternal, then drew it back, slowly, shaking his head with a profound sadness that seemed to ripple through his entire being. "Time of death," he murmured, his voice hoarse, strained, a whisper against the cruel shriek of the monitor's dying breath that still echoed in our ears. 3:17 a.m. He looked at Mark and Sarah, his gaze a silent apology for the limits of his science, for the helplessness of medicine in the face of such an ethereal malady. It was an admission of defeat, not personal failure, but the humbling acknowledgement that some mysteries lie beyond the scalpel and the microscope. He was a good man, as I said, deeply human, and I could see the profound sorrow in his eyes as he accepted the defeat of all his medical knowledge. He had approached Annalise's case with a clinician's rigorous curiosity, searching for organic causes, for psychological explanations, for anything that could ground her extraordinary claims in the known world, anything that could offer a concrete path to healing. Now, in this excruciating moment, his medical framework collapsed, leaving only a shared human grief, raw and unadorned. The last, lingering sound of the flatline ceased, leaving behind a vacuum of silence more deafening than any noise, more suffocating than any scream. It swallowed the final echoes of the world as it had been, the world where Annalise was merely a sick child, perhaps a deluded one, but undeniably alive, undeniably here asterisk. Mark and Sarah, who had been clinging to each other, their bodies tense with a vigil that had promised no earthly reward, their faces etched with the cumulative strain of hope and terror, now slumped. Their collapse was not merely physical. It was the visible shattering of their very spirit, a sudden, complete surrender to the unthinkable. Sarah's silent tears, which had been a quiet stream throughout the night, became a river, coursing down her face in uncontrolled rivulets, soaking into Mark's hospital gown. Mark held her tight, his own shoulders shaking violently with the raw, guttural sobs that he could no longer contain, sounds that tore through the sterile air, each one a testament to a father's broken heart. My own breath caught in my throat, a physical ache blooming in my chest, heavy and hollow, as if a vital organ had been abruptly excised. A profound weariness, deeper than any sleep could cure, settled over me. The world, it seemed, had won. The cynics, the journalists, the skeptical diocesan investigator who had questioned Annalis's sanity and our judgment, they would all nod gravely and say, with a self-satisfied certainty, "We told you so." The story of the girl who talked with an angel had ended. just as the world, with its predictable, often cruel logic, expected it to. It was over. The impossible, beautiful dream, the tender seed of wonder that Anneliese had planted in my soul, had dissolved into the cold, hard reality of death. The finality of it was a physical blow, a crushing weight that pressed down on us, extinguishing the last embers of a hope we had barely dared to harbor, reducing them to bitter ash. The air in the room grew heavy, thick, not just with the scent of antiseptic, but with the cloying, inescapable odor of spent grief, of dashed hopes and extinguished prayers. I felt the profound exhaustion of my own spirit, a priest who had prayed desperately for a miracle, for a sign, for a reversal of fortune, but had only witnessed an end. I felt a failure, not just to this family, but to my calling, to God Himself. Then, from the very corner of the room, near the small, simple crucifix on the wall, a humble wooden carving that had, until this moment, seemed merely a decorative religious artifact, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint tremor in the air, a whisper of warmth against the chill of despair that permeated the room. My mind, numb with sorrow, struggled to register it, to make sense of a sensory input that defied the stark reality of the preceding moments. Was it a trick of my weary eyes, blurred with unshed tears and profound exhaustion, a phantom sensation born of grief? I questioned my own faculties, my own sanity. But then, undeniably, a soft golden light, the color of dawn breaking over a silent field, began to emanate. It wasn't harsh, not like an electric bulb or a sudden flash. It was gentle, diffused, as if woven from the morning mist itself, imbued with an inner luminescence that seemed to deepen rather than merely reflect. It pulsed faintly, a living glow, growing steadily, undeniably brighter, pushing back the encroaching shadows of night and sorrow. My eyes, still blurred with unshed tears that clung to my lashes, struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. It wasn't a reflection. There was no apparent source, no lamp, no window, nothing in the sterile hospital environment that could account for this burgeoning luminescence. It was simply asterisk there, asterisk. It existed, manifesting itself from an unknown dimension, utterly outside the realm of human explanation. As the light intensified, expanding its gentle halo outward from that quiet corner, bathing the stark white walls in a warm, ethereal glow, an utterly exquisite fragrance began to fill the room, pushing back the sterile scent of antiseptic, the faint undertone of human illness, and the heavy pall of grief. It was the intoxicating perfume of wild roses, sweet and pure, their delicate essence mingled with the earthy, spiritual richness of frankincense. It was an aroma that spoke not of manufactured scents, but of ancient altars and sacred spaces, of sanctity and consecration, of deep, primordial prayers echoing through centuries. This was not the manufactured artificial scent of a hospital air freshener. This was organic, vital, as real and present as the burgeoning light, and it permeated every fiber of the air, every breath we took. It wrapped around us, an invisible embrace, drawing us deeper into its mystery, stirring something ancient and forgotten within my priestly soul. We all turned, slowly, inexorably, towards the source of this impossible beauty, our movements unified by an unspoken magnetic pull. Mark and Sarah, their faces still wet with tears, their grief-stricken expressions now frozen in a tableau of disbelief, their bodies still intertwined in sorrow, looked from Anneliese's small, still form to the radiant corner. Their sobs had ceased, replaced by a stunned, gaping silence. Dr. Peterson, whose medical training demanded a rational explanation for everything, stood utterly paralyzed, his eyes wide, reflecting the golden glow, his jaw hanging slightly ajar, his scientific worldview momentarily shattered by this inexplicable sensory intrusion. The confident man of science was gone, replaced by a childlike wonder. And I, Father Michael, who had spent a lifetime wrestling with the mysteries of faith, grappling with doctrine and dogma, with human suffering and divine grace, found my practiced prudence utterly abandoned. The quiet skepticism, the careful neutrality I had maintained for so long, dissolved into nothingness. My heart, which minutes ago had been a leaden stone of sorrow and spiritual exhaustion, now began to beat with a wild, primal awe, quickening in my chest with an intensity I had never before known. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was the sacred terror of truly confronting the divine, a sudden, blinding revelation that we were not alone, that death was not the final word, that the boundary between the seen and unseen was astonishingly thin. The light pulsed again, more vibrantly this time, almost breathing, expanding to fill the entire quadrant of the room, washing over Annalise's pale, peaceful face in its ethereal glow. The shadows in the room, which had stretched long and melancholic under the clinical overhead lights, now danced with a joyful golden vibrancy, as if the very air itself was celebrating a profound and secret joy. And from the very core of that living light, a sound began to emerge. It was not a human sound, not a voice as we understand it, not an audible vibration of air. It was more fundamental, a resonance that vibrated through the very bones of my being, bypassing the ears to speak directly to the soul, to the deepest, most primordial part of my spirit. It was a chord, perfect and pure, a harmony of countless voices woven into one, distinct yet unified, shimmering with an otherworldly beauty that seemed to encompass all creation. It was the first note. A single, impossible sound, a preamble to a truth so profound it would tear through the very fabric of our understanding, proving beyond any shadow of doubt that the quiet, brave child, lying so still before us, had indeed walked among angels. And then that single, perfect chord of sound unfurled into a symphony, a chorus of harmony that defied all earthly understanding. It was not a voice I heard with my ears, not in the way one hears a person speak or a hymn sung. No, this was a sound that resonated deep within the chambers of the heart, a vibration that permeated every cell, every fiber of my being, awakening a recognition that was both ancient and utterly new. It bypassed the intellect and plunged directly into the soul, a truth spoken without the need for language's clumsy confines, yet undeniably articulated with crystalline clarity. The golden light, which had been pulsating gently, now seemed to breathe with the voice, expanding and contracting, its warmth wrapping around us like a divine embrace. The scent of roses and frankincense intensified, a celestial perfume that filled the small, sterile hospital room, masking the antiseptic temps with the fragrance of sanctity. My knees, which had been locked in a desperate stand against the encroaching despair, now buckled beneath me. It was not a conscious decision, but an involuntary, genuine reflection, a prostration before a presence so holy, so undeniably other asterisk, that my very body knew it must bow. Beside me, I saw Mark and Sarah crumple too, their silent sobs morphing into gasps of bewildered awe, their faces streaked with tears that now seemed to mingle grief with an impossible, dawning wonder. Even Dr. Peterson, the good man of science who had so steadfastly sought a rational explanation for Annalie's decline, stood frozen, his eyes wide, his jaw slack, a profound shock replacing the professional stoicism he had maintained. And then the voice spoke Annalise's name, Annalise. It was not a call, but an affirmation, a tender caress of sound that held within it the entirety of divine love, a recognition so profound it felt as if the cosmos itself had paused to acknowledge this small, brave child. Every facet of her being, her gentle spirit, her unwavering faith, her quiet courage, was encapsulated in that one perfect utterance. The sorrow that had choked my breath, that had weighed down my spirit for months, began to lift, dissolving like mist in the morning sun, replaced by a profound and inexplicable peace. Then came the message, each word a balm, a revelation, a command etched not into air but into the very fabric of our souls. Be not afraid. The words resonated with such power, such unequivocal comfort, that the very notion of fear seemed absurd, impossible. It wasn't a mere suggestion. It was an absolute truth, a divine reassurance that swept away the terror of the unknown, the agony of loss, the paralyzing awe of the moment itself. In that instant, surrounded by celestial light and sound, I knew that whatever lay beyond the veil of death was not to be feared but embraced. The child has been called home. This was the truth of her passing, redefined not as an end, but as a journey's culmination, a glorious homecoming. Annalise was not simply gone. She had been called asterisk. The passive sorrow of loss was transformed into the active joy of divine intention. Her frail body, lying still on the bed, was merely a discarded vessel. Her spirit, vibrant and true, had ascended to its rightful place. Her faith was a beacon in the darkness. Here was the affirmation, the vindication for a child dismissed as a dreamer, a liar. Her conversations, her simple, unwavering conviction, her radiant goodness, all of it was true. Her innocent belief, a tiny flicker in a world quick to snuff out the miraculous, had been seen, acknowledged, and cherished by the divine. It was not only a beacon for her own path, but a light meant to illuminate the doubts and shadows of our own hearts. Let her obedience be your lesson. This was the challenge, the call to action for the living. Annalise had listened, she had believed, and she had obeyed. Her life, though tragically short, had been a testament to profound spiritual discipline. This divine command was not just for us in that room, but for all who would eventually hear her story. A powerful reminder to open our hearts, to listen for the whispers of grace, and to align our wills with God's. God's mercy is endless. A wave of tender compassion flowed with these words, washing over our bruised and broken spirits. Mercy, not judgment. For all our doubts, our failures, our human limitations, God's love remained boundless, ever present, an ocean of forgiveness for every trembling soul. It was a reassurance that even in the face of death and suffering, His benevolent hand remained extended. And finally, with a resonant majesty that shook the very foundations of my being, believe, 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 not simply to accept, but to trust wholly, fully, with the complete abandon of a child. Believe in the unseen, in the impossible, in the love that transcends understanding. Believe in the miracle that was unfolding before our very eyes, a testament to truths far grander than any we could conceive. It was Cassiel. The angel Annalise had spoken of, the friend from the house of the Father, now stood before us, not in form, but in voice, bearing witness for the child who lay still. The presence of the light and the voice was so potent, so undeniable, that it seemed to push outwards from the room itself. I felt the pressure against the walls, sensed its expansion beyond the door. It filled the hallway, silencing the hushed nurses and hospital staff, their murmurs replaced by gasps of wonder and fear. And then, faintly at first, but growing stronger, I heard it, the collective gasp from outside, the distant murmur of the crowd. Then their awestruck silence, confirming that the angelic voice had indeed resonated beyond the confines of our sorrowful vigil, piercing the night for all of Oakhaven to hear. The impossible contradiction was made gloriously clear. God had called His little messenger home, gently taking Annalise into His eternal embrace. But He had not left us in silence. Instead, He had, with an astonishing act of divine love, allowed His angel to remain for a moment to speak for the child who could no longer speak for herself. It was an undeniable testament, etched in light and sound, to the absolute. Beautiful truth Annalise had carried, a truth that now echoed in the hearts of every witness, forever changing the landscape of our faith. The weeks and months that followed were unlike anything Oakhaven or I had ever known. The echoes of that angelic voice seemed to linger in the very air, a sacred resonance that had undeniably altered the fabric of our reality. The initial shock gave way to a profound collective transformation. Oakhaven, a town once divided by whispers and skepticism, was reborn. It was as if a great, purifying fire had swept through, burning away doubt and leaving behind a fertile ground for faith to flourish. The diocesan investigation was swift and thorough, but also deeply reverent. Bishops and theologians arrived, not with the skepticism I had anticipated, but with an open-hearted curiosity and ultimately a profound acceptance. The testimonies were overwhelming, unanimous. From the hospital staff to the reporters, from the fervent believers with their candles to the hardened cynics across the street, all had heard it. The meticulous reports, the gathered evidence, the sheer impossibility of human explanation led to an official declaration. Almost breathless in its pronouncement, A*, Vox Angelica*, the voice of an angel, a miracle. The change in the town was palpable. The cynics, those who had scoffed and jeered, were not merely silenced. Many were utterly disarmed, their hearts pierced by an undeniable truth. I saw individuals who had openly mocked Annalise's claims come forward, tears streaming down their faces, seeking baptism and reconciliation. It wasn't merely intellectual assent, it was a surrender of the spirit, a profound encounter with the divine that left no room for argument. Our little church, once quietly attended, overflowed with new faces, new questions, and new prayers. The questions were no longer about proof, but about meaning. What does it mean, Father? What does God want of us now? And the Vance family, dear Mark and Sarah, though their grief was raw and deep, carried it with a peace that surpassed all earthly understanding. Annalise was gone, yes, but her passing had been consecrated by the immediate divine presence of the angel Cassius. They knew with an absolute certainty that only grace can bestow that their daughter was not merely a child who had passed too soon, but a true saint, a messenger whose faith had brought God's glory into the world in a way few ever experience. They found solace not just in memory, but in the living, breathing proof of heaven's reality that their little girl had gifted us all. For me, the experience changed the very foundation of my priesthood. I had spent decades studying theology, administering sacraments, counseling souls, all based on a profound faith, yes, but also on ancient texts and traditions. I was, in many ways, a custodian of established rules and sacred rituals. But after Annalise, I was something more, something entirely new. I was a first-hand witness not just to the idea, of God's power, but to its living, breathing, and awesome manifestation. My sermons became less about interpretation and more about testimony. My prayers were infused with a new depth of humility and gratitude. I saw God not just in the gentle whisper of the Eucharist, but in the blazing, undeniable truth that had ripped through the veil between worlds. Annalise's story, the girl who talked with an angel, ceased to be a local curiosity and became a beacon for countless souls seeking light in the darkness. It was a poignant reminder, whispered now in awe rather than doubt, that faith is not a shield from suffering, nor a guarantee of an easy life. Annalise had suffered, she had faded, and she had died. But her story, and the miracle that crowned it, was a profound promise that even in the face of death, even when our human hearts are breaking, God's love can manifest in ways so powerful, so utterly miraculous, that it leaves the world forever changed. And so it was. We had witnessed not just a miracle, but the very heart of God revealed through the faith of a little girl. And in that revelation, we found not an end, but a new, glorious beginning.